Without a fundamental understanding of music theory, even some of the core principles, the terminology can be a little confusing, and especially when a single term has multiple contexts. Welcome back to the channel. My name's Chris. Today you will learn about thirds. Now there's a lot of numbers in music theory, right? Thirds, sixths, fourths, thirds, sevenths. You've heard all of these numbers before. I've chosen thirds today because even though all of these numbers have the same basic context, they're all intervals. Intervals are the distance between notes, and I'll uncover this when we zoom in. Thirds have a sort of a special case because they have more contexts than some of the other intervals. And that's because we use the interval of a third to build chords. So we're going to zoom in and we're going to put all this information on the fretboard, because it's one thing to listen to music theory and sort of like study theoretical principles, but the most important thing for us as guitar players is to bring this information through the fretboard so it's useful. So let's zoom in and I'll show you all about thirds. Okay, let's find out about thirds. Now all these numbers, thirds, fourths, fifths, sixths, sevenths, all of the numbers are just intervals. They relate to intervals, and intervals are simply the distance between notes. And this is not fundamentally just for guitar, it's for anything. On the piano, on any instrument, intervals are the distance between notes. So let's just review that really quickly. I'm just going to take this A string, that open A string, right, on the nut, 0 frets, that's A. When you go up to the 12th fret, that's also an A, right? We've gone through a bunch of intervals and a bunch of notes, and we've gotten to A again, right? And the whole thing repeats here. This interval is called the octave, and that represents the distance between A and when A repeats again. That's the same for any note, right? When you go up 12 frets from any note, you've gone up an octave. Each one of these frets and each one of these notes in between here represents a distance from our starting point and is an interval. Now I'm not going to go into all the different intervals. I want to focus on those thirds. Thirds come in two flavors, major and minor. And that's the core context. Once we get that atomic level information, all the other context that we apply to thirds uses that as its core context. So here we go. A string, right? Just go up 3 frets. 1, 2, 3. That distance is a minor third. From any note, up 3 frets, or a step and a half, right? Here's a whole step and here's another half step. A step and a half or 3 frets is a minor third. That's the distance between our starting point and this point. Go up a half step from there, and now the distance is called a major third. So that's 4 frets, or 2 steps. So we have the minor third at 3 frets, step and a half, or the major third at 4 frets, or 2 steps. That's the fundamental concept behind thirds. Those two distances are thirds, the minor third and the major third. As I said, all of the coming contexts use that information as their core sort of principle. The next thing I want to show you is the major scale. So here's an A major scale. If I simply number the notes in that scale, watch what happens when we get to the third. 1, 2, 3. Well, there it is again, right there. That's a major third. Remember, the distance of 4 frets or 2 full steps is a major third. This is a major scale. So whether it's the chicken or the egg, the third defines what kind of scale you're playing. Is it a major scale or a minor scale? If I play that same scale, let's just do the first 5 notes. Listen to this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If I play those same first 5 notes, but I use the minor third, I'm playing a minor scale. So the third defines what type of scale you're playing. In other words, the third note in the scale, that distance between the place you start and that third note defines whether the scale is major or minor. Right? So there's another powerful context, still just related to that interval of a distance of a minor third, which is a step and a half, 3 frets, or a major third, 4 frets, 2 full steps. Okay, the next thing we want to talk about here is that the distance of a third, either one of those, major or minor thirds, is the building block for building chords. Anytime you build anything, unless you're a caveman, you need a tool. When you build chords, the tool you use is the interval of a third. Now, it could be major or minor, and let me demonstrate that. So we're going to take this major scale again, and just concentrating on the first 5 notes, we're going to play every other note. And if you think about it, every other note is the third note, right? Play the first note, skip the second note, go to the third note. Start on that third note, skip the next note, and go to the 5th note. You're really going in thirds, right? So check this out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If I skip every other note, it's root, 3, 5. 1, 3, 5. We already know that this distance is a major third because we found that out here, right? Look at this distance to that next note. That's a minor third, right? So I've got a major third here and a minor third here. If I take this note, and it's an E note, and I put it on the next string, and I play all 3 of those notes at the same time, I've got an A chord. I've just built a chord using those intervals, either the major or the minor third. Right? Thirds, the interval of a third, is the building block of creating chords. That context, as a chord builder, is sort of one of the primary functions of thirds that none of the other intervals have. You can only build chords using thirds. There are some very, very slight exceptions, but every single chord you hear is built using thirds. That's why the term thirds has these multiple contexts. Okay, now I want to show you something else. You can use thirds as a sequence. So let's listen to this scale here. If I play this scale and sequence it in thirds, that describes the following thing. I'm going to play the first note, I'm going to skip the second note and go to the third note again. Then I'm going to return to the second note in the scale and do the same thing. It sounds like this. Let me just show you what I'm doing here. First note, skip the second note, play the third note. Go to the second note, skip the next note, and play the third note from there. Same thing here. So I'm sequencing the scale using this sort of thirds thing, skipping the second note and playing the third note instead. Starting here now, skipping the second note and playing the third note instead. So that's playing the scale, sequencing it in thirds. So there's another context, but we're still using the same thing, that distance between the first note and the third note, right? It's an interval, and it's either major or minor. Last thing we're going to do is I'm going to play thirds as dyads. Dyads are 2 notes played at the same time. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to play these notes in the scale, but I'm going to play each note and the note that's a third away from that note in the scale at the same time. It sounds like this. But all I'm really doing is playing these notes. And whenever I play any note, I'm also playing the third note away from it in the scale. Right? 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. See what's happening? I'm just playing the thirds as dyads. So multiple different contexts, but all relating to that interval of a minor third, 3 frets, a step and a half, or the major third, 4 frets, 2 full steps. Okay, so there you have it, thirds, and all of the contexts that we use that word in. there are two intervals called thirds. A minor third is a step and a half, or 3 frets on the guitar. The major third is 2 full steps, or 4 frets on the guitar. So there's that context. When you play a scale, that third note actually defines whether the scale is major or minor by the distance, right? By which third interval it is. Is it a minor third or a major third? From that starting point in the scale, the root of the scale. And then playing in thirds, right? Playing from any note in the scale, skipping the second note, and playing the third note, and then seeing those thirds as the building blocks for chords, right? Playing that first note, and then playing 3 notes away from it, and then going to that note and playing 3 notes away from that, and you've built a chord, right? So there's those intervals of thirds stacking together, building chords. That's pretty fascinating. And then we saw some other stuff, playing the scale, phrasing in thirds, going up a third, back to the second note, up a third from there. That had an interesting sound to it. And then playing those diatonic thirds, right? Those dyads, thirds stacked together, and just moving those along in the scale. So as you can see, there are multiple contexts for thirds that don't necessarily play out in other intervals. Okay, I've tabbed all this stuff out. I've put those tabs on Patreon and linked that in the description below. Head on over there if you'd like to get the tabs, or if you just feel like supporting the channel, that's the best way to do it. I hope this has been informative for you. I hope it's helped clear up any fog around this term thirds, and I hope you've enjoyed yourself. I'll see you next time.